Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, others. If you look at the discrimination in American society in the 1920s in particular, where basically Asian immigration was just shut down completely. And then you look at the taking of land and property during World War II in both the United States and Canada. What was interesting, I found in those two chapters, the research, was that Asian Americans were actually, by the 1920s, their kids were graduating at rates from high school higher than whites, graduating from college at rates higher than whites in places like California and nationally.
Mark Milke, thank you so much for joining us today and spending some time about the victim cult, a book that I think that you're making some waves with. Let me ask you right out of the gate, if I may, Mark, what do you mean by the victim cult?
Well, the two words, of course, take victim, take cult, put them together. And maybe the origin of the book is the best way to describe it. I've done a lot of work on Aboriginal policy over the years, and I noticed, especially growing up in Kelowna, British Columbia, there were some First Nations, like the West Bank one near Kelowna, that have done incredibly well. There's others. In fact, the fellow who wrote the foreword, Ellis Ross from the Haisla First Nation on the coast of BC, now an MP. But when he wrote the foreword to the victim cult, he had taken that First Nation from poverty to prosperity, to put it, quickly. And so I noticed kind of the victim mindset there, perhaps understandably, given some of what's happened to Native people in the country over the ages. But as I go into it in some detail on the victim cult, it's a bit dangerous to get stuck there, whether it's a person, but especially a town, a country, an empire. And I give examples in the book of all of that. But the victim cult is almost what it sounds like. You've got victims that are so possessed by the idea that they're victims, and they may have been, or they may not have been, and it almost doesn't matter. But they're so possessed by the idea that they've been victimized, and it defines them so deeply that it's impossible for them to move forward, which is dangerous. And also, when this metastasizes for the society around them, it can pull others down, and it can pull entire societies down. So I give examples in the book, but a victim cult is it's almost biblical in the sense of if the old it's either Old Testament, New Testament saying about what I think there was it was about Beelzebub, it was about the devil roaming to and fro throughout the earth. Well, if victim kind of cults roam to and fro throughout the earth, they really are quite dangerous in history and potentially now.
I think that we talk a lot about generational trauma now, which I think, and certainly in the Indigenous community, is worth noting. But is what you're saying that this isn't that it's fake? It's just that it's cumbersome, and it's to live within the cult of being a victim doesn't allow you a lot of options, and that's kind of the vibe that I got here.
Exactly. And I would never downplay anyone's suffering, anyone's real victimization, because first of all, it's not a kind of a therapy book. It's not even about individuals for the most part, except famous individuals in history like Adolf Hitler and Yasser Arafat, both ironically, for all the damage they did, claim to be victims, but claim their societies were victimized, and that's worth exploring. But for sure, I would never downplay true victimization. But the thing is, okay, are we sure? Because we hear today a lot of chatter about the past and history and how it impacts today, and for sure there's generational trauma, I assume. I mean, you can see it in people, given who their parents were or what happened to them. But again, this book is really about, yes, okay, but carefully and thoughtfully, there have been people in history who have been victimized, or their tribe has been victimized, right? I mean, Jewish people, for example, but the Holocaust, obviously, but somehow we're able to move on, not perfectly. I'm not sure anybody can do that, given the scope of sometimes what happens to people in entire societies and countries, entire groups. But nonetheless, they found a way to move on. And so in the victim cult, I give a positive example, actually near the end of the book, jumping ahead a little bit, to Asian Americans and Asian Canadians who were horribly discriminated against for a century. About a lot of them, their ancestors anyway, Asian immigration from China, from other places, started mid-19th century for both Canada and the United States. Initially welcomed, when the numbers became larger, it appears there was a turn in public opinion in places like California, and against immigration from China and elsewhere in Asia. And so Asian Americans, and the same was true here in Canada, began to push back, though. And I give 2 chapters at the end of the book to show how they pushed back, as they were right to do. Asian Americans said, look, especially the ones that were born there, we have all the rights other native-born citizens do of the United States. They wrote letters, they politicked, they went to court, sometimes succeeded, sometimes did not. But it took about a century for them to really gain full legal status and for the end of any discrimination, domestically, but also against immigrants from East Asia to end around just after World War II. But what they did is they focused on things like education. And what was telling, again, spoiler alert to the end of the book, Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, others, if you look at the discrimination in American society in the 1920s in particular, where basically Asian immigration was just shut down completely. And then you look at the taking of land and property during World War II in both the United States and Canada. What was interesting, I found in those 2 chapters, the research, was that Asian Americans were actually, by the 1920s, their kids were graduating at rates from high school higher than whites, graduating from college at rates higher than whites in places like California and nationally. And what that spoke to was an ethos of no matter how badly some of our fellow Americans, not all of them treated them badly, but no matter how some fellow Americans treat us, Asian Americans took the view that they were going to persevere, push back where they could, but also educate their kids. And they were very entrepreneurial, in some cases because they had to be, because some of the professions were shut. But that led to what we now know is almost a cliche. Asian Americans, Asian Canadians are at the top of the income and wealth heaps in both countries. And that's a good thing. What was interesting was that even the most discriminatory period in American history, that Asian Americans succeeded on the education scale anyway.
And they succeeded in the country that was discriminating so hard against them in such a quick and vicious manner. As you think about it, it's a dark spot in history, really, isn't it, for Canadians and Americans that it went down that way. Let me ask you. So I'm fascinated by the history element of this, and that you went down the road of history to provide some examples and I guess a little bit of a societal overview of how victim cult has been destructive. Can you give me a couple more of these? You've given me a couple of examples of, how, people have overcome. And I think that's the winning end of this, as you point out, spoiler alert, this is possible. But where else in history have we seen this go off the rails?
Almost everywhere, right? It's almost a permanent human condition or temptation, rather. And so a couple of clear examples from the book, though. Germany. So most people are familiar with the claim, which many people agree with, I don't, as I point out in the book, that Germans were victimized by the Versailles Treaty and that this led to the Second World War, at least the justification for it in the minds of Germans and the Nazi leader, Adolf Hitler. Actually, and there was a permanent sense of victimization, though, in Germany by that time, by the time the Versailles Treaty came along. So I actually went back and did research on okay, why would Germans feel that they're victimized? And before Versailles, the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I. Well, because Germans actually were victimized. If you go back to the end of the 18th century, into the early 19th century, the French were occupying parts of southern and western Germany. And indeed, the Germans were victimized, as often happens in occupations and wars. And you had all the nasty, tragic evil that goes on in wars. And it happened to Germans under the French. Now, the Germans were able to expel the French by the early 19th century. And what happens when people have been victimized, either individually or corporately? They kind of try and go, okay, who am I now? Or, and so how do you recreate an identity, especially nationally? What the Germans did is they kind of looked to philosophers who they ignored in the century previous, when they were kind of one with the French in terms of the Enlightenment eras and ideas. And so what the Germans did, though, is they retreated into thinking that was pretty nationalistic in a bad way. Some nationalism can be good, some can be very destructive. So they went towards what was considered kind of blood and soil. You're born here, then you're a German. and this combination of this is what it means to be a German, the soil element of it. But there were exceptions. You couldn't be Jewish and even convert to Christianity, Protestant Christianity, and be accepted as a true German. There was nothing you could do. You were still, seen suspiciously. Later in the century, when classical liberalism really took off in Great Britain, the Germans were very suspicious of outside ideas, including classical liberalism, right? The ideas of John Stuart Mill, the idea that actually the government serves the people, which had been a pretty long-standing belief in English circles, right, since the Glorious Revolution or since the Magna Carta. And the Germans rejected this, right? Very collectivist mindset from the top down, and that the state represents us. And that's how we find our identity. Very different than the Anglosphere, right? England in particular at the time, and the countries that sprang from England, such as Canada, the United States, and so forth. So, but the Germans thought of themselves as victimized.
So you're saying reframe. So I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
But reframing for identity, that's the challenge in that right there.
Right. So
because so what you're saying at that point, it becomes a nationalistic effort, as opposed to something that is meant to be a national effort or a
nationalism in the worst sense of the word. And again, there's good ideas and bad ideas. And the bad idea was, we're not going to accept ideas from elsewhere. This is what it means to be a true German, defined by blood and birth. And rejection of outsiders to the extreme. And it was kind of a cultural nationalism, which we hear again today, by the way, including in native circles and others, that what people really need is just a restoration of their culture. Those nasty colonialists have injured our culture, when in fact the truth in human history is, if you want to succeed, beg, borrow, and steal from other people's cultures, right? See what works out there and steal it. And you have to be open to that. But the Germans went down this road, and they had this very deep sense of victimization long before Versailles, long before the end of World War I. And in fact, they had victimized others in their own history. They victimized the French in the late 19th century. So it goes back and forth. But they had this deep belief in their victimization. And then boom, after World War I and the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, they capitalized on that. They capitalized on the sense of unfairness in the Versailles Treaty. But I go into the book why they shouldn't have been. They shouldn't have seen that treaty as a victimization. But nonetheless, that was the popular notion. And it led to a deeper sense of victimization, which Adolf Hitler and the Nazis exploited. In the land of Beethoven and Bach became the land of Dachau and Bergen-Belsen. And of course, as we all know, that kind of deep grievance was only extinguished with the arrival of us and other allies in a 6-year war that finally beat it out of the German population by 1945, to the tragedy of everyone.
So I guess I see the ladder would climb on this, from trauma or from this experience, this original victimization. We seem to ping pong higher and higher and higher up on the ladder until it becomes a mass issue.
It's a temptation. The same thing happened in a very different culture, in Rwanda. Most people are familiar with the Rwandan genocide of 1993. What they may not understand is the same sort of debates, the same sort of accusations went on in Rwanda that you heard in other cultures that overdose on victimization rhetoric. So, brief history lesson: Rwanda was occupied by it was the Germans first, then the Belgians. And there was some argument that the Belgians favored the minority Tutsis, who were, depending on the year, about 5 to 10%, 5 to 15% of the population. And the majority Hutus, about 85%, and the Twa, which were 1%. But the Hutus, the majority population, were mainly farmers. The Tutsis were ranchers. And there's some argument that the reason, the latter, the Tutsis, who were the subject of the attack and the genocide in 1993, the reason they were wealthier was not just because of maybe some favoritism by the colonials, the Belgians, and the Germans before that, but ranchers simply make more money in that era, and maybe today, I'm not sure. And so the argument is, though, from the Hutu, the majority population, by independence, that okay, the colonialists favored the Belgians, and by the way, now that we're in control, the Hutus, we're going to make life difficult for you Tutsis, because we're going to take revenge, we're going to even out the scales. Affirmative action programs, as we call them today, racial identity.
Right.
And the Tutsis were warned: do not engage in politics. In the army, they were discriminated against. They were considered too influential in the schools and universities, so there was a quota system. There were pogroms now and then after independence in 1960 that attacked the Tutsis. kind of a foreshadowing of the eventual 1993 Rwandan genocide. And the language was really destructive as well, Mike. You hear language about Indigenous versus non-Indigenous today. It's not the first time in history you've heard this. And I'm not saying Canada is equivalent to Rwanda in 1992, leading up to 1993. But the language I find is offensive because I'll get there in a moment. But the Rwandan Hutus used the same language. They saw the Tutsis as interlopers, later arrivals, the same with the Twa. And Hutus said, we were here first. You guys came later. And that was very dangerous and destructive. So there's very much an us versus them, which, by the way, is at the heart of one of the problems with victim thinking, is you're not looking at people as individuals who may have suffered for a whole bunch of reasons, not the way you or your tribe has suffered, but for their own reasons or their own experiences, their own histories. So people don't look at each other as individuals. They simply look at each other as you're non-German and I'm German, or you're Tutsi and I'm Hutu, and so on and so forth. It becomes very dangerous, especially when the rhetoric ramps up.
It feels like human nature almost, doesn't it, Mark? I mean, I hate to say it, but I think that in any scenario where any of us were in the face of, losing our identity in our own homes, it might be an easy way to cope, frankly. We are a group, they are a group. This is, almost how people find solidarity in hard times, and yet it sounds so destructive and obviously is. It makes me wonder now. I see the media and I see politicians out there, and they tend to capitalize on these moments. Does your book address that? And I'm sorry, let me have a kick at that can, if you don't mind, because that was one of the original thoughts that popped to my mind was, wow, this is really something that is a tool that is leveraged all too often and for the wrong reasons.
For sure, leaders matter. And I point out in the victim cult some of the leaders who mattered negatively and positively in human history. So, because they can really lead a population into the swamp, so to speak, toxic ideas.
Hitler is a great example of that right out of the gate that you pointed
Right.
out. Yeah.
Right. And so, and he's not the only one. Now, what all this misses, let me answer the question by first mentioning the view of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago, right? He had a very, I thought, poignant observation. Here's Solzhenitsyn, who's tossed into the labor camp in the Soviet Union in the late 1940s because they made a joke about Joseph Stalin. And he sees people around him who are still involved in the blame game. They look at a group and say, if only that group wasn't around, if we got rid of them, all would be fine here in the Soviet Union. This is what he's observing in the labor camp, or maybe even among, groups in the labor camp, right? They're fighting with each other. And Solzhenitsyn later writes in the Gulag Archipelago this observation, which is that, paraphrasing, but from memory, the dividing line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And so people who always think in group terms and make the mistake of, if only that person or that group over there wasn't around, we'd be fat and happy. No, you've got the potential for evil in yourself, which is what Solzhenitsyn was pointing at. But leaders matter in this. So some examples in history. Let me take two terrorists. So you're familiar with Jerry Adams, who was part of the provisional IRA. I think he denied that, but certainly the political wing of the IRA, Sinn Féin. And Marty McGuinness. Compare them to Yasser Arafat, right, leader of the Palestinian Authority, but the PLO before that, and maybe concurrently. I have a chapter on Yasser Arafat where I point out, look, with due respect, Israel tried to do peace deals and did do peace deals with Egypt and Jordan in the late 1970s. As we know, more recently, they've done peace deals with Arab nations, other Arab nations. So they've tried to do land for peace. But you need someone on the other side you can work with. And Yasser Arafat was famously offered a peace deal in 2000 by Ehud Barak, the Israeli president or prime minister, I forget which he was, and Bill Clinton, the American president. And he walked away. Arafat did. His aides couldn't believe it. Bill Clinton couldn't believe it. Arafat walked away from the table. And I theorize in the victim cult that one of the reasons for this is that Arafat was a permanent revolutionary. Plus, he just wanted dead Jews more than he wanted a peace deal with Israel. Now, he could have chosen a different path, and he could have chosen to really enforce some discipline on his side to get there. And some of his young aides wanted a peace treaty with Israel, and he didn't. I think because he's a permanent revolutionary. In the way that, ironically, for all their dalliance with terror that Marty McGuinness and the Sinn Féin leader, Gerry Adams, were not, in this sense. You may remember the Easter Accords that Great
Yeah.
Britain and the Provisional IRA and the Sinn Féin negotiated in 1998, I believe it was, when the ink was signed.
I was in
Well,
high school at the time, and I remember it was everywhere. It was the news.
exactly. There's a
Yeah.
famous book, I forget the name, but I mentioned it in the Victim Cult, from an Irish journalist who covered, Northern Ireland and the UK and the terror and the troubles, as they called them, for decades. He wrote a wonderful book about Northern Ireland, but also the peace deal that came about in 1998, the Good Friday Accord. And what he kept hinting at was in the run up to that deal, before it was signed, before the ink was signed, that sometimes the British were warned in advance of a possible attack on their positions in Northern Ireland. It could have been a police station, could have been an army unit, their cell. And he strongly hints that someone in the Provisional IRA and Sinn Féin leaked information that the British were about to be hit, about to be attacked. He didn't say who, but you can almost read between the lines, and you're like, is Marty McGuinness or is Gerry Adams or their henchmen, are they alerting the British? Why would they do that? Well, because they perhaps come to the conclusion finally that they were more interested in having a peace deal than having more dead Brits, to put it bluntly. Um, and that's what I suspect. But that's where Yasser Arafat never got to. He was a permanent revolutionary, and that's the danger. And you know, whether he truly believed in victimization of the Palestinians or not, probably, but certainly he was a permanent revolutionary. And that combined with the notion of victimhood, utterly destructive for Palestinians, not just Israel to this day, other leaders now in Gaza and the West Bank, but for Palestinians and Israelis, but for Palestinians themselves, because of one of the many decisions to avoid peace.
That pullback was sort of at a point in time in our modern history where it could have made a really big difference. So much in the Middle East, in that theater at large, I think we had a moment, a slice in history to really make an accord work at that moment. And I think you're right. As you look back, it just felt like, no, we don't want peace. We want to continue with our mission of terror based on being victimized. It's an
Right.
interesting perspective for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, there's a famous Arab journalist who I quote in the Victim Cult in this chapter on Yasser Arafat, who shortly after, several years later, maybe after Arafat died in 2003, wrote a column saying, look, the Palestinian leadership really has to, and he was quite blunt, grow up. And they have to get past this revolutionary stage. And he said and he made reference to World War II and Bora Bora, Tora Tora rather. Is it Bora Bora or Tora Tora? The Japanese war cry. And um, I think it's Bora Bora.
I think you're right. We just took a look. Bora
Yeah.
Bora, we'll go Bora Bora.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
But he said, look, the Palestinian leadership keeps this rallying cry up of constant war and revolution, as
Yeah.
opposed to doing the boring stuff, which is maybe why Yasser Arafat didn't bite on it, the boring stuff of running a city state. Because look, I think Gaza and the West Bank still have the potential to be the Singapore of the region, or akin to what's happening over in the United Arab Emirates. And the leaders there, I think the Palestinians have been ill served by the leadership. It's not to say Israel has been perfect, but that's not the standard, right? Any more than Great Britain or Canada or the United States was perfect in 1939, or in the case of the US in 1941. That's not what's happening. You're hit by an existential crisis in the case of Israel, and you have to do something and defend yourself. And so I put a lot of blame on the Palestinian leadership over the decades, which were at the table, could have made a deal, especially Yasser Arafat, but even since, and chose not to. So that's another example, though, where again, and there's some truth. I mean, in the chapter, I note the Palestinians. This is not universally true. Some were chased out of Israel. Some left voluntarily. Some Arab nations told Arabs in what became Israel to leave. On the other flip side, Israelis, or Jews rather, were expelled from Arab countries after 1948. So there was plenty of victimization, plenty of wrongs. Nonetheless, I would side with the need for a mainly Jewish state. Now it's 21% Arab and whatever it is, 70 something percent Jewish. But without getting too deeply into that modern day issue, the point is the Jews from Arab states that were expelled with a couple of suitcases and lost their property moved on to Buenos Aires, to Toronto, to New York, to Montreal, made their lives. Was it a perfect ending? No, hardly, any more than for some Palestinians. But the difference is we refuse to make, and the Jewish people refuse to be permanent victims, I would say, in the sense that they kind of knew they had to get on with their lives. There was never going to be a return to Baghdad and Cairo for them. So as tragic as it was, and as tragic as some Arabs, not all, again, not all, plenty left voluntarily, but Arabs that were expelled from what became Israel had to start over. But that hasn't happened in the sense that we still call people today refugees that are literally third or fourth generation, people in towns that have relocated, right? So there needs to be kind of I think almost a mental psychological switch in the leadership of the Palestinian leaders, and I'm sure there's some Palestinian people, and I know of some who wish that they could get to a peace deal with Israel, but the victimization narrative is not helping.
Do you think educators are missing this one slice of perspective on history and even modern day current events?
I think so. Look, I mean, history is tough in the sense that there's no. I think understanding the lessons from it and the lessons to draw from it are often more art than exact science. So, for example, there is something to the case. I'm not dismissive in the victim cult or in my writing or at all that you just say, oh, get on with it, get over it. I think that's the wrong way to approach it and insensitive to say to people. I do think you have to carefully, gently ask people if they're really sure that what they're experiencing today is a result of something that happened 200 years ago. Let me give you some concrete examples there, or at least how you deal with wrongs in history. I think the closer you are to the wrong, and if it's happened to you, the greater claim there is for compensation. For example, right? There's a modern day debate over slavery in the United States. Should they compensate slaves for slavery?
Hmm.
I think it's problematic when you go back a century and a half now, or 170 years, or whatever it is, after slavery's been abolished, to make that argument for a whole bunch of reasons. But the closer you are to that event, the more justification there is, the more call there should be for compensation. Clear example: late 18th century, the Quakers held slaves. When they released them in the late 18th century, because they were part of the evangelical Christian movement that said this is wrong, right? And others who were opposed to slavery, the Quakers compensated their freed slaves, knowing they'd done a great, egregious evil to Black Americans who they held. Now, 170 years later, or after the Quakers, 230 some years later, can you really make a tight causal link between modern day Black American incomes to slavery? Thomas Sowell, the Black American economist, has famously argued, no, you can't actually. And more proximate causes in the last 70 years, Thomas Sowell has shown this. Education levels were increasing among the Black community up until about the 1950s, despite the egregious discrimination still going on in the United States against Black Americans. The incomes were progressing. You hit the 1950s and the welfare state, or a bad education system, bad ideas in the education system, and the decline of the Black American family. And Thomas Sowell, among others, has argued that's a more proximate cause for some of the problems in today's Black American communities. And then he also teases out statistics, right? If your ancestry is from the West Indies and you weren't a slave, or at least your family was not a direct slave in the United States, West Indian Black Americans have much higher incomes than others. And we even see that in Canada. So it's interesting to delve into the statistics and find out, okay, look, why are some groups succeeding that look the same and others not, right? And it speaks again to blaming everything on the past is a bit dangerous. Now, again, if I step on your toe yesterday, Mike, and break it or whatever, or crash into your car, I owe you, right? For sure. But the further you go back, the weaker the link is between cause and effect. And at some point, I would argue it disappears completely, which is where the responsibility element comes in. At some point, we have to be responsible for our own lives, or try to, at least in a liberal democracy, right? Not in a tyranny where you have very few choices, perhaps, but even there, I guess you can still choose your attitude. But it is
Mark,
dangerous.
I had I had a try at this. I had an attempt at this conversation with my stepson about a year ago now, where I thought that I had my ducks in a line when it came to saying basically, okay, you have to put being a victim aside for the sake of accomplishing, making the change, being the change. And what was thrown back at me was a tough hardball, and that was systemic racism is the
Right.
reason that we must pay attention to this. What do you say to that?
Well, I'll give the Thomas Sowell answer, but also the Matthew Lau answer. Matthew Lau has done a lot of work for us on DEI, diversity, equity, and yeah, inclusiveness. Uh,
Inclusiveness, yes.
and But in the United States, for example, Thomas Sowell has analyzed this in depth over 5 decades. Again, this argument that yes, systemic racism. First of all, let's unpack racism. Let's make a distinction, because personal prejudice has not completely disappeared, but it's a lot better than it used to be. If you look at some of the statistics, you go back 50 years, half the American population, I don't know about the Canadian stats, probably similar, half the American population didn't favor interracial marriage, right? They were opposed to it, at least half. Now, almost everyone is fine with it, thankfully. So attitudes have changed over the past 70 years, for example, since the 1950s. But distinguish between personal prejudice, which was always remnants of. You probably will never really, you will probably never be able to get rid of it completely for a whole bunch of reasons. But now let's talk about institutional discrimination, because people conflate the two, right? They'll go online today, find someone who's a bigot, and say, "You see, prejudice exists." Yes, yes, I admit that. But institutional discrimination is different. A century ago, if you were Chinese in San Francisco, you were not allowed into White Hospital. A century ago, your admissions to Harvard, I assume McGill, if you were Jewish, were limited, in terms of the numbers. Jews were considered, too successful, so they were limited in terms of some of the higher, institutions of learning. And you can go on and on. Again, as we talked about a moment ago, East Asian Americans and Canadians were discriminated against across the board in both countries. So that was institutional. Native Canadians didn't have the vote restored to them until 1960. That was actual institutional discrimination. And John Diefenbaker and the Parliament of the day restored it, as they rightly should have, and it never should have been taken away. So when people say systemic racism, I'm like, first of all, understand that it's changed and prove to me where systemic racism exists today. I think it does, in the sense of we now discriminate against people, with pale skin, which I think is unfortunate, because it's another way, and people do this in the best of intentions, Mike, and it's absurd. They will say, well, we need to make up for the discrimination of the past. Really?
Because we're in the present.
Yeah, yeah,
What
yeah,
can we do about This is
yeah.
one of the things that I find, and I was excited to talk to you about this, Mark, because one of the things that I don't know if maybe it's just in my makeup. I haven't been especially discriminated against. I grew up in a very Italian community as a
Mhm.
munja cake, as I was called often, which was fine. I was well fed and I loved the community. I didn't really feel, well, I kind of did feel that discrimination a little bit. It didn't really affect my meals on a day-to-day basis, or, how I was viewed in the church community or in my school community. But one of the things that I've consistently thought to myself is, if we're stuck in this, how can we ever come together? And I think,
Right.
the Israeli Palestine example is the most glaring one on earth. I don't know that we can ever come together in that scenario, but there is absolutely no way in the current scenario that it's possible.
Right. Let me give you a closer example to home. The danger is, well, there's a couple of dangers, and you pointed to one. It's going to be hard to get people to be on the same page if one group sees the other based on skin color, ethnicity, history, whatever, as the oppressors, and the other one's the victims, which again simplifies human history beyond the absurd. To go back far enough in history, we've all been, or ancestors and victims of very unfair or worse treatment. So, and you want to unite people around, you want people to be tribal, but around a good set of ideas, right? So I think we
Mhm.
need to unite again in Canada around what I call classical liberal ideas, which, pre-1960s meant the rights of the individual to be treated as an individual. That's where we were going for a century, with the arguments of John Stuart Mill and Mary Wollstonecraft on the rights of women and others, and Martin Luther King Jr. saying stop treating people as anything other than, based on character and merit. That's the kind of world he wanted for his children. Content of the character type language.
Right.
So treat people as individuals. Understand that people need to be free. Understand that people need to be held accountable for their choices. Be responsible. Boring economic stuff that matters, like property rights, all the way back to Magna Carta. So unite people around a set of good ideas and principles that help people be free and prosper. And at the same time, remember that responsibility is part of being in a rights-based society, not just being selfish, because you can be. So I'd like to see people united around that idea. But also, here's the danger: when people blame everything on past systemic racism, when it did existed, or other forces that I think have expired or irrelevant, they actually might miss an actual cause and effect vis-a-vis modern day incomes and wealth. Let me give you a clear example. Native incomes, indigenous incomes. Matthew Lau has done some work for us on this, and I'm not surprised with the results because Thomas Sowell showed the same thing for Black Americans. When you do apple to apple comparisons, so let me back up. If people just look at averages, for sure, indigenous Canadians, their incomes are on average lower than other Canadians. And you can't stop there though. That's an average. You have to look at what goes into the average. And so when you equalize for age, for example, Native Canadians on average are younger than, say, Japanese Canadians, right? Who are closer to the average age of something like 50 something. Whereas
Okay.
for Indigenous Canadians, 30 something. Why does that matter? Because in your 50s, you're at the top of your income earning potential as opposed to a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old. That matters. Or education. If you just look at the average, you won't see that a lower proportion of Indigenous Canadians have higher education. But when they do, the positive thing is, if you account for all that, which Matthew Lau did in one of our Aristotle Foundation studies, you will see that apples to apples, there's almost no difference between the median income of a Native Canadian and other Canadians if they have the same education level, bachelor's or master's or PhD, work full year, full time, live in an urban environment. So these things matter. And then all of a sudden you're forced, I think, should be forced to confront the question of, yeah, okay, show me the discrimination in incomes because it's not existing. And I think it was master's level or higher that Matthew found in Stats Can data for Native Canadians, they're actually slightly above other Canadians. And if you unpack this again, you look at the education rates, you'll find East Asians are at the absolute top of the income pack compared to every group. Why? Because they have higher education levels. And so
The other thing that comes to mind is taxation on that income.
Mm.
So if you are achieving a higher income or an equal income
Right.
at the base level and you're not being taxed the same way, you are more successful financially.
You are. I mean, this would be the argument about, Indigenous Canadians on reserve. Anyway, what used to be called treaty Indians in the constitutional or Indian Act language don't pay income tax on reserve or, GST or HST. Nonetheless, but that's a bit of a more difficult comparison. The easiest one is to say, okay, off reserve, show us where the discrimination is if you're earning near the same income at a bachelor's level or potentially higher at the master's or PhD level as a Native Canadian vis-a-vis other Canadians. And again, the differences pretty much disappear depending on the education level you're looking at when you do apple to apple comparisons. Now, I think that's fundamentally positive. What it shows is if someone leaves a reserve in Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec, Northern Manitoba, someone in a rural area where admittedly there's not much educational opportunity beyond high school. You don't have a university on a reserve of 600 people in Northern Manitoba, for example.
Right. Yeah.
So if you move to the city, you get an education, chances are you're going to do just fine. And that's very positive. It speaks to so what I'm pointing at is the actual problem is not institutional racism that's causing lower on average incomes. First of all, look at the apple to apple comparison. And then second, understand that people are succeeding if they're not on the reserve for the most part, unless the reserve is near an urban center. And, look at the education levels. That's fundamentally positive. It means there is a way out of the poverty trap for Native Canadians, like other Canadians, right? And we see this across ethnic groups. So education levels matter. So that's very positive. So that also defeats the notion that, well, it's really about the colonialists, it's really about, which by the way, is just a silly argument. I mean, every society has, whether it's tribal, or it's an empire, there's good and bad in all sort of forms of human government. Tribal is maybe, low tax, easy to organize. If there's 10 of you or 100 of you in any society in Europe or in the Americas in history or now. On the other hand, lots of prejudices can stay in very rudimentary tribal societies and often do. It takes the British, for example, to pound out, get rid of sati in India. So should the British Empire have been in India? Alan Bloom, the 1980s philosopher who wrote The Closing of the American Mind, used to ask this of his students, and his students would dodge the answer, which is not an answer. He's like, look, the British were there. Should they have outlawed sati or not? And should the British in North America have outlawed slavery in British Columbia, which was existing past when the British Empire was trying to get rid of it in 1834, and it didn't disappear from northern parts of British Columbia until the late 19th century.
I
So when
did
people,
not know that.
yeah, oh yeah, and
Wow.
there's a famous book from California that talks about Aboriginal societies and slavery in the Pacific Northwest, published in 1997. I'm trying to remember the name, but I link it. I cite it in the Victim Cult. But all this to say what? Um, human societies and human governance is never perfect in any society. The question is, okay, do you appreciate the fact that the British tried to get rid of sati in India and slavery in the Americas? And were they preferable to the Spanish? Were they preferable to some First Nations? Probably. Um, and so to simply say, look, all colonialism was bad, okay. How did we
Well,
arrive at that simplistic conclusion?
like you say, it's a wiffle ball swing. It's an easy one to knock out without a lot of opposition. There's not a lot of Mark Milkes in a dinner party that can say, well, just one second, because there's more to that story. And I think that we're in an era, and this kind of rounds up my questions. And I think you kind of see where I began and where I ended up on this is we're in an era now where social media becomes the weapon of choice for victim cult, in my opinion. Am I wrong about this? This is a dangerous era for this.
Well, social media, but I think all media. I think it's so deeply entrenched in in academics as well, academia. And part of this comes from philosophers like Foucault and others, and Jacques Derrida, and some of the people in the education stream, French philosophers and others. And there's a Brazilian one, Freire is his name, you know, um, which I note in one of the chapters. How do we get here? And I think it even helps understand modern day issues. People ask, how could gays for Palestine side with basically Islamic fundamentalists, right, who would throw gays off the roof of a building in the
Yeah.
Palestinian territories, at least in Gaza? The answer is actually very simple. They're united by victimization. It's a bit naive of gays for Palestine and anyone else to think that they could be they could live their liberal ways in the good sense that we know in the West, in a place that doesn't tolerate homosexuals or lesbians. Gays or lesbians is the old-fashioned term for whatever reason.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't use the alphabet, so gays or lesbians.
but I know what you're saying, this is that's almost a glaring example. It feels almost ridiculous when you see that.
They're joined
But
by
yeah,
victims.
this
Yeah,
but it's almost legitimized by regular media and social media that
right.
this would be the case, and
Yeah,
and thank goodness they don't get on a plane and land themselves in Gaza and see the
yeah.
results of it. I think that would be a different scenario. But you're right in the sense that when we use social media, that almost legitimizes it. Okay, we're out here doing. Here's our opinion, and here's some horrible footage, and here's an emotional impact I've left on you. No real education, no real history, no background, no current events associated with it. Just pure emotion that often feels like virtue signaling to me.
Hmm. It is, and virtue signaling in the wrong way. I mean, to first of all, I'm old-fashioned. I think if you've got virtues, you're doing something good. I wouldn't shout it from the rooftops, right? Let others speak for you or recognize your accomplishments. So I'm not a big fan of virtue signaling, as it's called to begin with. But insofar as someone wants to say they're a good person or they've got the right ideas, well, be careful about that. We're again back to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. First of all, we may be overestimating our potential to get it right 100% of the time, ethically or in any other way. And then, second, if you're mistaken, watch out. You may be favoring, an idea that is pretty destructive. And again, the victim cult was written in part to say, watch out for this. Again, I wouldn't downgrade, or it wouldn't I wouldn't dismiss actual victimization in history or now. But the danger is you have the wrong cause and effect link, right? Ancient discrimination somehow is responsible for my income today. maybe Mark Milke and maybe Mike is, maybe we're more responsible, for how we've ended up. Maybe that's 80% of it. Maybe 20% is our parents, or 19%. Maybe 1% of it's our grandparents. I don't know how you quantify this. They simply, like I said earlier, it's a bit of
That's
an
a great
art.
point. I mean, I don't know. I did not have a silver slide,
Yeah,
uh, through life to this point. Maybe you did. But I
no,
gather that
no,
that's not even the point. We both ended up here,
no,
like many others
yeah,
around us. There's, from every culture and every walk of life, there's authors, there's way better podcasters
right,
around the world than the one you're sitting with right now. But the difference between being here and not being here had very little to do with me being or not being a victim.
right. Well, and even where people are, I mean, the danger again is you're not looking at people as individuals. And imagine, I mean, this is the example I give, and I give it in the book. My grandparents, who on my paternal side, one came from Germany, the German section of Poland, 1927, maybe 1928. My grandmother was a German from Ukraine, and they ended up, they tried to leave in 1914 when she was 3 years old to end up in Edmonton. The war stopped them, and then they ended up back in Central Europe, back in Siberia for a while, back to Central Europe, finally made it to Canada. In her case, I think it was 1927. My grandfather arrived in Edmonton in 1928. They met, married, raised a family and grandkids eventually. And but they survived the Great Depression. My parents lost everything in the 1980s in Kelowna when interest rates were 21%. And my mother worked at Sears. She never considered herself a victim, but that's what you had to do. But imagine, or another example, imagine saying there a couple of years ago, there was a position advertised at the University of Calgary for a certain color, and I won't say which because it's irrelevant. But you had to be this color to get the position at the business school. As I tell people, imagine you're Jewish, and your parents or your grandparents survived the Holocaust. And in essence, what the University of Calgary was saying in this job advertisement, and this is the problem with DI, nice sounding words aside, the problem with that advertisement, the problem with DI, where we got to make up for the past by looking at people in groups, not as individuals. Imagine saying to the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, you can't have this job because you're the wrong skin color, you're privileged. Her parents and grandparents
How?
were
Yeah.
Holocaust. Yeah. So that's the problem with not looking at people as individuals, which is the great sin in human history, right?
I
That's
think
why.
inclusion is everything. It's what we do as Canadians.
Right.
It's it's the nature of what we set out to do here. I think defining it, labeling it, gave it too much
Mm,
power to have its own divisiveness,
right.
and I think we've all seen that.
Right.
Uh, Look, Mark, this is fascinating. I'm so delighted we had a chance to do this. I'm going to recommend people check out the book, The Victim Cult. Mark Milke is the author. And I hope as we make our way across Canada, we're going to find our way into your town and we can drag you out for a pint and we can talk some more about this. Thank you so much, Mark.
I'd be happy to do that. And you're welcome, Mike. Thank you.